Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is 2021. 2020 is over. Let's hope that 2021 brings us good stuff. Let's just go with good stuff. That is my hope. I hope you had a wonderful holiday season and that your new year is going well so far. We, as usual, are here to talk about a book in particular. Today I'm interviewing author James A. Ross about his debut novel called Hunting Teddy Roosevelt. This is a historical fiction book about, as you guessed, Teddy Roosevelt. It's 1909, and Teddy Roosevelt is leaving office in a funk. Much of what he had hoped to accomplish as president remains undone, and his controversial decision to follow George Washington's example and not to run for a third term now seems like the biggest mistake of his life. Though he leaves in spectacular fashion, assembling the largest safari ever undertaken and leading it on a year-long expedition through East and Central Africa. Roosevelt is not only hunting in Africa, he's being hunted. James Pierpont Morgan, the most powerful private citizen of his era, wants Roosevelt out of politics permanently. Afraid that the trust-busting president's return to power will be disastrous for American business, he plants a killer on the safari staff to arrange a fatal accident. Roosevelt narrowly escapes the killer's traps while leading 264 men on foot through the savannas, jungles, and semi-deserts of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Congo, and Sudan. The safari is also a time of discovery, personal and political. In Africa, Roosevelt encounters Sudanese slave traders, Belgian colonial atrocities, and German preparations for war. In his personal life, he struggles to help his teenage son and safari companion deal with the Roosevelt family curse of depression and alcoholism. He also reconnects with a childhood sweetheart, now a globe-trotting newspaper reporter, sent by Roosevelt's enemy, publisher William Randolph Hearst, to chronicle the safari adventures and uncover the former president's future political plans. Surviving all, Roosevelt returns from Africa alive and begins his campaign to regain the presidency. But J.P. Morgan has no intention of giving up. Can Roosevelt's dynamic vision for the future of America, Europe, and Africa survive the machinations of one of the world's wealthiest men? So there you have. I love that very detailed description that is on the back of the book. You now have a very good idea of what Hunting Teddy Roosevelt is about. Like I said, it is historical fiction, but while I was aware of the safari that Roosevelt went on, I mean, most people probably know that he was a big game hunter. And I mean, he collected some amazing specimens, and those specimens are still on display and have been used in lots of different studies. It can be a little disturbing to read about the extent of the safari, the number of animals that were collected. Anyway, while I was aware of that safari, I was not aware of the threat against his life, which is not made up. I mean, it's not something that James just came up with. He actually found an article that pointed to this attempt on Roosevelt's life, and then he expanded on that article and imagined what must have happened, did a lot of research, looked into everything that he possibly could in terms of this story, and then wrote this book. And I want you to hear his words on all of this, because he, of course, tells it much better, and I don't want to give too much away. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview. Again, the book is called Hunting Teddy Roosevelt. The author is James A. Ross. Hi, James. Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here, sir.
Happy to have you. We are here to talk about your historical fiction book called Hunting Teddy Roosevelt. Before we get to the book, though, if you would share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Well, at various times, I've been a Peace Corps volunteer in the Congo, a CBS News producer, a low-level aide to an Illinois congressman, a Wall Street lawyer, and now I am a debut historical novelist.
Very good. Nice. And you live in Wyoming.
I do, in the beautiful Teton Valley, where there are more elk than people.
Yes, which is very cool.
Yeah.
I love that. So, as I mentioned, the book is called Hunting Teddy Roosevelt. Can you give an overview of the story?
Basically, this is the story of an attempted assassination of ex-President Theodore Roosevelt while he was on safari in Africa following his second term as president. Roosevelt probably was the most popular president since George Washington and could have easily had a third term for the asking. But he decided to do what he thought was the right thing and follow Washington's example and not run again for a third term. And instead, he decided to go on safari. There were no presidential pardons or pensions in those days, so Roosevelt, once he left office, had to make a living, and he signed a contract with Scribner's Magazine to do a series of articles chronicling the safari, the purpose of which was to collect specimens of African game animals for the Smithsonian Museum in the New York Museum of Natural History. What Roosevelt didn't know, and that's really what this book is all about, is while he was hunting, he was also being hunted. There was an assassin sent to make sure he did not return from Africa alive. And fortunately for history, the assassination attempt then, as well as one later, when he returned to the States and ran again for president in 1912, were both unsuccessful. But this is the story about the first attempt, and the reason I decided to write it is so many people don't know about it. It's not in history books, it's not in the various Roosevelt biographies, and the answer to the question why is equally as fascinating as the assassination attempt itself.
Yeah, why isn't it more well known? It was mentioned that there was a small article in an Italian newspaper, and that was pretty much the only press it got. I mean, you'd think it would have been bigger news.
Yes, and when I ran across it, it raised all sorts of interesting questions. One, of course, is why isn't it in the biographies, and why isn't it in any of the English language newspapers? Who would have and would have had the power to suppress it? That's one question. The other, equally interesting, is why send an assassin to try to kill an ex-president who's on his way to a part of the world that in those days would, probably do him grievous harm anyway? This is, before penicillin, 911, and so on and so forth. And this guy is off in the jungle of Africa for a solid year, totally out of communication with the civilized world. He may very well not come back alive anyway. So why send somebody to kill him? And Hunting Teddy Roosevelt is an attempt in the form of entertainment to answer both questions. As far as why it's not in history books, my theory is that most of the American newspapers that had the resources to have international news coverage at the turn of the century were all controlled by William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst himself intended to run for president in 1912. And looking at the coverage in the Hearst newspapers, including the International Herald in 1909, you see the coverage of the Roosevelt Safari is all about slaughter of game animals. It's designed to make Roosevelt look like a animal killing buffoon as opposed to a serious politician. And my belief is that Hearst simply suppressed the story and other stories in order to deny Roosevelt the kind of coverage that would enable him to come back from the safari and run as a credible candidate for president again. The second question, of course, who would have tried to kill an ex-president is a bit more difficult to answer. Sadly, in modern times, we're all too familiar with the assassination of or attempts on the life of politicians running for office or sitting presidents. But in 1909, Roosevelt is in essence a political has-been of his own choice, and he may not return. So who would expend the effort and resources to try to make sure he doesn't come back from Africa alive? That's why Hunting Teddy Roosevelt is fiction as opposed to nonfiction, because my answer is, in truth, speculative. My prime candidate is J.P. Morgan. It's pretty well documented that Morgan and others bought the Republican convention of 1900 that nominated William McKinley. And McKinley, as a sop to the Tammany Hall, added Roosevelt as his vice president, even though Roosevelt was of the opposite political spectrum within the Republican Party. McKinley was pro-business. Roosevelt was very progressive in the modern sense. Well, unfortunately for the folks who bought the convention, McKinley was assassinated 6 months into his term, and they got Roosevelt for the next 7.5 years, which was not what they paid for. In fact, he spent Roosevelt 7.5 years breaking up business monopolies, then known as trusts, and basically being a total pain in the neck to J.P. Morgan and others, around Wall Street. So if you ask who would benefit from Roosevelt not coming back from Africa alive to run for president again, the answer is pretty straightforward. The folks whose lives and pocketbooks were impoverished by Roosevelt's administration.
Yeah, it's all fascinating, and it's just, like I said, amazing that we don't hear more about it.
And on that little bit of history, not very well known history, we are going to take our first break. And when we come back, James will be talking more about where he found this story, how it germinated the idea for the book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am enjoying some historical fiction talk with author James A. Ross about his debut novel, Hunting Teddy Roosevelt. Before the break, we were talking about why Teddy Roosevelt was not only hunting, but being hunted. And so let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
Where did you first come across the story, and was that your jumping off point for the book?
The jumping off point for the book was a meeting I had with my then agent. Was supposed to be a a book signing for a murder mystery I had written, and at the last minute, the publisher called and backed out. And this was 2009, the crash year. And my agent said, "Well, look, the publishing industry is in turmoil right now. We're not going to be able to do more with this book right now. Why don't you write another? And let's kick around some ideas." Well, I'd spent some time in Central Africa as a young man in the Peace Corps and then with CBS News in the Congo. And I'd always wanted to write a book set there. So I wanted to write a book set in Africa. And my agent's idea of, what might make a popular book was pretty straightforward. His idea was, exotic locale. Okay, check Africa. Larger than life character and global stakes. Well, I had met some of the larger than life characters of the 1970s while I was there, Idi Amin and others, but I couldn't quite, figure out how to make that into a book. And as I'm just doing some basic research, I ran across Teddy Roosevelt's book, African Game Trails, and fell in love with it. It's probably the best safari book ever written. And he's a wonderful writer, and he really brought that time and place alive for me. So I'm thinking, okay, I write about Central Africa, maybe Roosevelt's the main character, what might have been going on in the safari. And I started researching the safari, and I plugged in Roosevelt's safari and the name of the liner that brought him to Africa, which was the SS Hamburg. German liner, and bingo, there pops out this little blurb, really, in a Naples newspaper from March 1909 that reported the Carabinieri, the Italian police, had taken off the ship carrying Roosevelt to Africa. When it docked in Naples, an anarchist who allegedly had tried to kill Roosevelt with a knife while he was on board. And that was the genesis of the story. I mean, that caught my attention immediately. It raised the questions we just talked about. Who would do such a thing at that time? He's an ex-president and has been. Why isn't it in the American newspapers? Because I spent a year looking for anything at all in English. And eventually I found two things, reprinting the Italian blurb in newspapers that were not controlled by Hearst and had virtually no circulation, and that's it. So that's how it came about.
My first comment is I love the sort of offhand comment from your agent of, "We'll just write another book." Like, oh, okay, I'll get right. Give me an hour. I'll get right on that.
Well, I was probably the last on his long roster of authors at the time. I think this book that we were trying to sell, he had convinced me to cut about a third of it in order to meet the commercial parameters of mystery novels of the time. And I'd asked him to help me out with it because, as you may know as a writer, after a certain amount of time, your eyes glaze over and you don't know flesh from bone anymore. And his answer to me was, "No, I can't do that. You're on your own. I'm working with Ken right now on his book." Ken is Ken Follett, and the book was Pillars of the Earth. So, right. I mean, I knew exactly where I stood in the pecking order as his writers at the time. Something that was repeated, by the way, when Hunting Teddy Roosevelt came out. I don't think there's a worse time possible for launching a book than in the first global shutdown of bookstores since Gutenberg invented the printing press. But second to that is having those bookstores finally open and realizing that one of the groups that could not work from home during the shutdown were book printers. And then finding out that in that backlog, you are not at the head of the list for having your books printed. Stephen King and John Grisham and all those folks, or Ken Follett, are ahead of you, and you just have to wait patiently in line while the book printers get back to work and the bookstores fill up with their books and not yours. So it's no fun being an author if you're. Well, actually, it is fun being an author, but there are many different ways you're told where you fit in the pecking order, and the pandemic created a new one.
Wow. When it came to writing the book, talk about writing historical fiction with so many well-known characters, especially the fact that Teddy Roosevelt is the main focus of this book. How was it writing a novel about such a larger-than-life person such as Teddy Roosevelt?
Fortunately, my career put me in contact with the different kinds of people I could draw on. I spent, as I said, some time on Capitol Hill, so I had a good feeling for politics, and I spent most of my working career after that on Wall Street, and was pretty familiar with the J.P. Morgan types. And I think the key to writing historical fiction or any kind of fiction really, is to back away from the larger than life aspect of some of these people like Roosevelt and Morgan, and concentrate on the human. What do we all have in common? One of the things I hope comes across in Hunting Teddy Roosevelt is the humanity of the father-son relationship between Roosevelt and his son Kermit, who was suffering from depression and alcoholism, and later succumbed to it. I think that human aspect allows people to appreciate Roosevelt the man, as opposed to the public figure who's in part the creation of media. And I think that's true of all historical fiction. You may be dealing with larger than life characters, but the key to making them real and understanding them is to focus on their humanity and what they and we have in common.
Yeah, thank you. And just that bringing that relationship into the story, I think really does help, because it's a larger than life character. It's also this really grand epic safari. I mean, just the scope of the safari is amazing. I can imagine it would have been easy to get caught up in just in trying to describe everything that happened on that safari. So I think bringing in that relationship was really key.
As we head into our second break of the podcast, I will just say that I've said before that historical fiction novels that include real-life characters, whether that's just a cameo, whether they have a fairly large role, it's clearly about Teddy Roosevelt in this one, that's a pretty large role. The writing of those historical figures always fascinates me, because I enjoy reading about them and having them appear in the books that I'm reading, but I feel like I would be way too intimidated to write them. Like I would just feel constantly like I was doing them a disservice in some ways. So I'm grateful that other people do not have those feelings, or if they do, they're able to overcome them and write those characters so that we have historical fiction in such a way that the characters are true to what we know about them, even if the story around them may be somewhat fictionalized, very fictionalized, what have you. Let's go ahead and take that second break. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the book inside the book, which is Teddy Roosevelt's writings about his time in Africa. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author James Ross about his book, Hunting Teddy Roosevelt. Before the break, I tried to say the name of Teddy Roosevelt's book, and I ended up stumbling all over that. It was actually called African Game Trails, and that is where we pick up with the interview.
You mentioned Roosevelt's book, African Game Trails, which I'm sure does describe the scope of that safari. How did that book then influence or inform the writing of your book?
I used it as the skeleton of my book. Basically, it follows Roosevelt's safari from British East Africa, what's now Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and he spent a year on foot. 264 men. Carrying 40 bundles on their head, walking across Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the Congo, and the Sudan, and having adventures along the way. I used Roosevelt's book and his itinerary, and even many of his descriptions of the hunting scenes, and told the understory. Basically, while he's focused on his mission of collecting animals for the Smithsonian and the New York Museum of Natural History, what's going on below the surface are, one, somebody's trying to kill him, but two, and perhaps more importantly, he's realizing as he encounters the complex political situation in Africa at the time, which mirrors the preparation for what was to become World War I in Europe, he realizes that he has to come back and run for president again. There's just what he sees in the Congo, genocide on the scope that rivals the Holocaust. He sees in Germany, East Africa, obvious preparations for war, and comes to the conclusion that he needs to play a role. He needs to come back and lead America again, and perhaps redress the colonial atrocities in Africa and broker a peace between England, France, and Germany involving a readjustment of their colonial empires, which would hopefully avert World War I. And of course, had he been able to do that, the world would look different today. If he came very close to winning the election in 1912. If he had, I doubt there would have been a World War I. And if we didn't have World War I, we wouldn't have had World War II. And without that, China, or Japan, not China, would be the dominant power in Asia. And the Middle East would not look as balkanized as it is today. And the place of the U.S. in that new world would be entirely different.
Now there's an alternate history book if I've ever heard one. How long
we came very close.
Yeah. How long did you spend researching before you wrote the book?
2 years.
Okay.
So it was probably 2 years of research and 2 of writing.
Okay, that is impressive. What are you working on now?
I just signed a contract for a 3-book mystery series. Coincidentally, the first book in the series is the one that my ex-agent wasn't able to sell in 2009. It's called Cold Water Revenge. It's coming out in April of, I guess it's 2021, about 5 months from now. And it's about 2 brothers romantically involved with the same woman, and the troubles that ensue when they discover she's a murderess, and one realizes the other is helping her cover it up. So it's a bit different from Teddy Roosevelt, but it was fun to write.
Yeah. And you said that was a series? Did I hear that right?
Yes, it's the first in a 3-book series.
Okay, that is fun, and it's nice that you were able to then get back to that book that had to be put on the back burner in 2009.
There are so many stories in writing and film about projects that take forever to bring to fruition. It's almost a commonplace, but it's a testament to the perseverance of the arts, I guess.
Absolutely. Are there other writings of yours that you would like to talk about? I mean, I know you've got some short stories and you've done other types of writing. Is there anything else that you would like to highlight?
Well, for listeners who are interested, there are many stories, both written and performed, on my website, jamesrossauthor.com. And one of the things I would love feedback on is whether one of those performed stories would be of interest to the reading public if I were to expand it into a book. I told a story for the Moth Radio Hour, which is up on my website, involving a pretty hair-raising adventure that I and my then girlfriend had in the Congo in the mid-1970s, getting caught up in a civil war there, and the dare-and-do adventures of staying one step ahead of the rebel army trying to overtake the government forces in the town where we were refugees in, and how we finally got out. If your readers would care to hear that story, it's on my website, jamesrossauthor.com. And if any of them think it would make a good book, it's certainly one that I've been toying with writing. I just I have to get through this 3-book murder mystery series first and fulfill that obligation before I get to it. But if I have my druthers, that's my next project.
Okay. You have had a very interesting career path. When did you start writing, and is it something that you'd always wanted to do?
Well, my dinner party response to that question is I wrote my first book in college, and I published my first one the same year I started collecting Social Security. So there was a long gap in between. Again, the arts are not for the faint of heart. If you've got the itch, you're going to have to scratch it. Whether you can make a living at it or not depends a lot on chance. And there can be a long time between when you start and when you finally start getting some recognition. In my case, it's been my entire adult life. I have a son who's also got the itch, and he's out in LA now trying to break into Hollywood as a screenwriter. And his worst nightmare is it takes him as long to get traction as it took his dad. But I assure him I'm probably an outlier in that regard.
Let's go ahead and take our final break of the podcast. When we come back, James will be giving his advice for aspiring historical fiction authors. And so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media, from Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author James A. Ross.
Do you have advice for aspiring authors?
I do. I would encourage anybody who's got the storytelling bug to explore all the different avenues for expressing it. I improved my own fiction writing greatly when I discovered oral storytelling, which I now do a lot of at different venues. As writers, we there's often a long gap between the creative product and the feedback we get on it. Sometimes years, and it's the reality for most writers that they can spend months or years on a piece of work and then start sending it out to agents or publishers, only to get the feedback of thanks but no thanks, with nothing more. You don't know why, you don't know what's not working, and so on and so forth. In oral storytelling, you not only get feedback, you get immediate feedback. You're up there on stage, you've got a live audience in front of you, they're there to be entertained. You tell your story, and within a half a minute whether you've hooked the audience or not, and sometimes why. I mean, one of the things I learned early on in my storytelling was not to make an assumption that your audience gets your cultural references, and this is particularly useful for writers of historical fiction. One of the challenges of hunting Teddy Roosevelt was to cram some history into the book without slowing down the narrative. But I realized I would have to cram some history into it because I couldn't assume that everybody knows who Teddy Roosevelt is or what his story was about. And I learned that through oral storytelling. I was up on stage at a bar here in Wyoming, and I was telling a story from my youth. So it was set in the Vietnam War era, and I referred to Ho Chi Minh. And I looked out at the audience, and I realized, as an audience of, the working folks of Jackson, Wyoming, who are out for an evening's entertainment. So they're all in their 20s and 30s. And I realized they don't have a clue who Ho Chi Minh is. They probably think it's it's an entree at the local Thai restaurant, not realizing it's the name of the leader of North Vietnam during the war. So you learn things like that in oral storytelling. Okay, you can't assume your audience knows the history. You got to get it in there. The challenge in the art is to get the history in without slowing down the narrative, so that it's no longer an entertaining novel. It's a history book. But I would recommend to any aspiring writer that they try the oral storytelling as well. There's a lot to be learned there.
Thank you. That's really cool. Nobody has brought up that bit of advice before, so I think that's really helpful. And it's always interesting to think of what people are familiar with in terms of history or cultural events. It's Yeah. I keep seeing things on Facebook about Y2K and kids, I mean, my niece is 20, so she's not even familiar with Y2K and the whole big deal that it was at the time. So yeah, you have to kind of think about what your audience is going to know or not.
Yeah, the flip side of that, or maybe another facet, is if you write historical fiction, and it's or any kind of fiction, and you use contemporaneous references, your audience today may get all of them. If you're writing a book in 2000, your audience could be assumed to know what Y2K meant, but your book may not stand the test of time if somebody picks it up 20 years later. The common cultural references of that era are going to be unknown to the new audience, and that demands a bit of thought as you sit down and compose a story. Today's audience may, get it, but what do I have to do to make sure that, my grandkids get it if they happen to pick up the book, out of a dusty trunk one day?
Exactly. Yeah, that is fascinating. When you take time to read for yourself, who are your favorite authors and what genres do you tend to be drawn to?
Well, I don't know if it's oddly enough, but for a fiction writer, I read very little fiction. Most of my reading is nonfiction, and it's history, spirituality, and travel. And in the fiction area, I'm still a fan of Hemingway, as I think most writers of my generation. We learned at the master's foot of how to write simple declarative sentences and eschew purple prose and highfalutin description. But in my own personal reading, I've gravitated towards nonfiction.
That actually kind of makes sense, given. I mean, I only know you from one book, but nonfiction kind of makes sense from the book that you have written. So you've mentioned your website, and so can you remind people of the website, of the address of the website, and then also if you're on any social media where they might be able to find you?
Yeah, the website is jamesrossauthor.com. And I also have a author's Facebook page, which is james.a.ross.author.
All right, thank you. James, we've talked about a few different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention, whether in terms of writing in general or about the book, Hunting Teddy Roosevelt?
I think we've covered the landscape, Sarah. It's been fascinating.
All right. Yes, it has. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I so appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about your debut novel.
Thank you once again to James for, again, taking the time to talk to me about his debut novel. Is there an echo? Did you feel like you just heard those words? I do always appreciate the authors who join me. I hope I convey that. I mean, I do very much appreciate talking to all of the authors that I speak with, and James is no exception, so I am grateful for him joining me on the podcast. I am, as always, grateful for you, my listeners, who join me every week to listen to new author interviews, to learn about new books. I hope that you are finding lots of new ideas for books to read. I hope your TBR list is growing by leaps and bounds, and that you have found some new authors and some maybe even some new genres that you hadn't before read too much in. That was grammatically incorrect, but you get my point. Thank you to you. And I hope if you are a fan of this podcast and you have not already done so, you would consider following us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you, again, are a fan and would like to help us out a whole lot, if you could leave us a review, whether that's 5-star or you write us a review. That really, really helps us to continually get the podcast out to more people who love books. And so I would be very appreciative if you were able to help us out with that. It is time to wrap up this podcast, but there are more to come. So join me next time when I am speaking with author Mark Watson about his new book called Between Conversations. It is a collection of short stories, 9 stories from a world that is historic, modern, and futuristic. It is sci-fi fantasy in that genre, so join me for that conversation. In the meantime, I hope you're having a wonderful week, and I hope that week, as always, involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.